the summer of 1940, as Nazi boots echo through the streets of Paris, a young Algerian-born writer sits in a cafe, watching the world fracture around him. The sun beats down mercilessly, and somewhere in his mind, a character named Mersault is born. Mother died today, or yesterday maybe, I don't know. These words will haunt readers for generations, marking the birth of literary absurdism and the death of comfortable certainties. The Mediterranean sun becomes a character in itself, beating down on the white stones of Algeria with an intensity that blinds and burns. In Camus's world, this light reveals everything and nothing, the harsh clarity of existence stripped of meaning, the brutal honesty of a universe that offers no explanations. The sun doesn't judge, it simply is, indifferent to human suffering and human joy alike. Albert Camus breathes life into his protagonist while war rages across Europe. Born in poverty in French Algeria, Camus understands the weight of otherness, the sensation of being a stranger in multiple worlds. His tuberculosis-scarred lungs carry the rhythm of mortality, each breath a reminder that life is finite and precious. His mother's silence becomes Mersault's emotional numbness, a literary inheritance of profound disconnection. The typewriter keys strike like gunshots in the quiet of his small apartment. Each letter forms a rebellion against the philosophical traditions that promise meaning where none exists. Camus doesn't write about the stranger. He channels him, becomes him, lives inside the skin of a man who refuses to lie about his feelings. The authenticity cuts like a blade through literary convention. Mersault's emotional flatness mirrors the shell-shocked generation emerging from World War I. Europe has witnessed mechanized death on an unprecedented scale, and traditional values lie buried in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme. Camus captures this spiritual numbness, this inability to feel what society expects. His protagonist becomes the walking wounded of an entire civilization. The Arab man on the beach exists in a liminal space between humanity and symbol. Camus never names him, never gives him a voice, never allows him to step fully into the light of characterization. He remains a mirror, reflecting the colonial tensions of French Algeria and the dehumanizing effects of imperial power. In his silence, entire histories of oppression whisper their truths. The shooting happens in a moment of sensory overload. The sun's glare, the blades flash, the sweat stinging Mersault's eyes. Violence erupts not from passion or calculation, but from a perfect storm of physical discomfort and existential numbness. The act becomes almost automatic, a reflex rather than a choice. 4 additional shots ring out like punctuation marks on a sentence already complete. The courtroom transforms into a theatre where society performs its rituals of meaning-making. Lawyers and judges desperately search for motives, for the comfortable narratives that explain why people kill. They cannot accept that sometimes actions spring from no deeper source than the intersection of circumstance and indifference. Justice becomes a collective delusion, a story we tell ourselves to sleep at night. Camus' philosophical training at the University of Algiers shapes every sentence. He has studied the ancient Greeks, absorbed their tragic vision of existence, understood that humans are capable of both nobility and absurdity. His thesis on early Christian philosophy teaches him how belief systems rise and fall, how certainty crumbles under scrutiny. Philosophy becomes flesh, walking through the streets of colonial Algeria. The prison cell measures exactly 12 feet by 8 feet, but it contains the entire universe of human solitude. Here, Mersault discovers that freedom was always an illusion. We are all imprisoned by our mortality, our inability to fully connect with others, our desperate need for meaning in a universe that offers none. The walls whisper secrets about the human condition. Marie's laughter echoes through the narrative like a bell tolling for lost innocence. She represents the possibility of connection, of love, of all the things that might give life meaning. But Mersault cannot reach her across the chasm of his own emotional numbness, cannot pretend to feel what he does not feel. Her joy becomes a reproach to his honesty. The chaplain arrives bearing the weight of 2,000 years of Christian tradition. He offers salvation, redemption, the promise of meaning beyond death. But Meursault has already stared into the abyss and found it staring back. He cannot accept comfort he does not feel, cannot embrace hope that seems false. Truth becomes its own form of worship. Colonial Algeria provides the perfect setting for existential alienation. The French pièce noire lives suspended between cultures, belonging fully to neither. The Arab population remains largely invisible, present but unacknowledged. Meursault exists in this liminal space, a stranger among strangers, his disconnection reflecting the broader social fractures of imperial society. Geography becomes psychology, landscape becomes identity. The funeral scene strips away social pretense with surgical precision. Meursault's failure to cry, to mourn appropriately, to perform grief according to social expectations marks him as fundamentally other. Society cannot tolerate authentic emotion, or the authentic absence of emotion. We must all wear the masks of conventional feeling. The tear that doesn't fall becomes evidence of inhumanity. Camus writes in the shadow of his own mortality, tuberculosis, serving as a constant reminder of life's fragility. He understands that death is not the opposite of life, but its defining characteristic. Every breath carries the knowledge of its eventual cessation, every moment exists in dialogue with its own ending. The disease becomes a teacher, instructing him in the art of living urgently. The beach becomes a stage for the fundamental drama of human existence. Here, under the pitiless sun, all pretense melts away. The confrontation between Meursault and the Arab man strips away the veneer of civilization, revealing the raw mechanics of violence, the thin line between order and chaos. Sand and sea witness the birth of the absurd hero. Meursault's mother haunts the narrative without ever fully appearing. Her death sets the story in motion, but her life remains largely opaque. She represents the mysteries we can never solve, the people we can never fully know, the relationships that define us through their very incompleteness. Her silence speaks volumes about the impossibility of true understanding. The examining magistrate waves his silver crucifix like a magic wand, attempting to transform Meursault into a repentant sinner. But the magic fails. The cross remains just two pieces of metal, the ritual just an empty gesture. Meursault cannot be converted because he has already seen through the illusion of transcendence. The sacred becomes profane through the simple act of honest observation. Camus joins the French resistance, understanding that even in an absurd universe we must still choose our actions. His writing becomes a form of resistance, a refusal to accept comfortable lies about human nature and social order. The Stranger is itself an act of rebellion against literary and philosophical conformity. The pen becomes a weapon against the tyranny of false meaning. The old people at the funeral home keep vigil through the night, their faces carved by decades of experience. They understand something that Meursault is only beginning to learn, that we are all alone in our journey toward death, that solidarity is an illusion, that each person must face the ultimate questions without help. Their knowing eyes reflect the wisdom of profound solitude. Heat becomes a character in its own right, distorting perception and dissolving the boundaries between self and environment. The sun's assault on Meursault's senses parallels the assault of existence on human consciousness. We are all vulnerable to forces beyond our control, all subject to the tyranny of physical reality. Temperature becomes philosophy, weather becomes wisdom. The trial reveals the machinery of social meaning-making in all its arbitrary glory. Meursault is condemned not for killing a man, but for failing to cry at his mother's funeral, for swimming the day after her death, for refusing to perform the expected emotions. Society cannot tolerate authentic indifference. The verdict arrives before the crime is even committed. Camus' journalism in Algeria exposes him to the brutal realities of colonial oppression. He witnesses the systematic dehumanization of the Arab population, the casual violence of imperial authority, the way entire peoples can be rendered invisible. This knowledge seeps into his fiction, colouring every interaction with the weight of unspoken histories. Truth becomes unbearable, and yet it must be borne. The guillotine waits at the edge of the narrative like a promise kept. It represents the ultimate assertion of social authority, the final word in the conversation between individual and community. But it also represents the absurdity of human justice, the way we pretend that killing can solve the problem of killing. The blade falls on our illusions about moral clarity. Meursault's final epiphany comes not through redemption but through acceptance. He realizes that the universe is neither hostile nor friendly, it is simply indifferent. This realization is not a cause for despair, but for a strange kind of freedom. When we stop expecting meaning from existence, we can begin to create our own. Indifference becomes the foundation of authentic living. The Nobel Prize Committee will eventually recognize Camus' contribution to literature, but the real recognition comes from readers who find their own experience reflected in Meursault's Alienation. The stranger lives in every person who has ever felt disconnected from social expectations, who has ever questioned the meaning of conventional morality. The award honors not just the author, but the authentic outsider in all of us. World War II rages as Camus writes, and the spectre of meaningless death hangs over every page. Millions die in gas chambers and on battlefields, their deaths serving no greater purpose than the death of the Arab man on the beach. The war provides a backdrop of historical absurdity for Meursault's personal absurdity. History becomes a mirror, reflecting our individual struggles with meaninglessness. The nursing home represents society's way of managing the inconvenience of aging and death. We warehouse the elderly, keeping them at a safe distance from the daily business of living. Meursault's mother dies among strangers, her final isolation a preview of the solitude that awaits us all. The institution becomes a metaphor for existential abandonment. Camus' philosophical essays on suicide and the absurd provide the theoretical framework for Meursault's practical demonstration. The question is not whether life is worth living, but how to live authentically in full knowledge of life's ultimate meaninglessness. Meursault becomes the embodiment of absurdist philosophy in action. Abstract concepts find flesh and blood in fictional form. The café conversations of post-war Europe echo with questions that Meursault embodies. How do we live after witnessing the collapse of traditional values? How do we find meaning when all the old sources of meaning have been discredited? The stranger becomes a representative figure for an entire generation searching for new ways to be human. Coffee cups hold more philosophy than lecture halls. Algeria gains independence in 1962, but the colonial tensions that inform the stranger remain relevant wherever power creates invisible populations. Meursault's inability to see the Arab man as fully human reflects the broader blindness of privileged societies to their own violence. The novel becomes a mirror for contemporary readers. Literature transcends its historical moment by capturing eternal human failures. The rhythm of Camus' prose mirrors the Mediterranean sensibility, economical, precise, unforgiving as the sun. Each sentence carries the weight of careful consideration, each word chosen for maximum impact. The style itself becomes a form of philosophical argument, demonstrating that clarity of expression can coexist with complexity of thought. Language becomes landscape, syntax becomes psychology. Meursault's honesty about his lack of grief challenges every reader to examine their own emotional performances. How often do we feel what we think we should feel? How often do we perform emotions for social acceptance? The stranger's refusal to lie about his feelings becomes a challenge to our own authenticity. Truth-telling becomes a radical act in a world built on polite deceptions. The French intellectual tradition of the 1940s provides fertile ground for Camus' innovations. Sartre, Beauvoir and their circle grapple with similar questions about freedom, authenticity and social responsibility. But Camus charts his own course, refusing to embrace the optimism of existentialism while maintaining faith in human dignity. Philosophy becomes a battlefield of competing visions of human possibility. The eternal return of summer in Algeria provides the novel's temporal framework. Each year the sun returns with the same merciless intensity, the same capacity to reveal and destroy. Time becomes circular rather than linear. each moment containing the potential for both revelation and violence. Seasons teach us that some patterns are inescapable. Prison libraries across the world contain countless copies of The Stranger, read by inmates who recognize something of themselves in Meursault's isolation. The novel speaks to anyone who has ever felt condemned by society, anyone who has ever stood trial for being different. Literature becomes a form of solidarity among the marginalized. Books become bridges between solitary souls. The beach scene resonates with readers across cultures because it captures something universal about human nature: our capacity for violence, our vulnerability to circumstances beyond our control, our tendency to justify our actions after the fact. The specific becomes universal, the historical becomes eternal. Sand remembers every footprint, every act of violence committed in its presence. Camus' early death in a car accident in 1960 adds poignancy to his exploration of life's randomness. Like Meursault, he becomes a victim of circumstances beyond his control, his death as arbitrary as the killing on the beach. The author's fate mirrors his protagonist's philosophy. Existence is fundamentally absurd. Life writes the final chapter in its own metaphorical style. Contemporary readers find new relevance in Meursault's Alienation as social media creates unprecedented opportunities for both connection and isolation. We perform our emotions online, craft our identities for public consumption, and struggle to distinguish between authentic feeling and social expectation. The stranger lives in every carefully curated profile. The digital age resurrects old questions about authenticity and performance. The novel endures because it asks questions that have no easy answers. How do we live authentically in an inauthentic world? How do we find meaning in meaninglessness? How do we love in the face of mortality? Meursault offers no solutions, only the example of someone who refuses to lie about the human condition. In the end, we are all strangers to ourselves, and perhaps that recognition is the beginning of wisdom.